Queen Anne Boleyn, at the zenith of her power, stands beside King Henry VIII, her silhouette a stark promise of a new dynasty for England. The hope of the Tudor line rests on her ability to produce a male heir, a weight that presses down on her with every passing day. In September of 1533, the royal nursery fills not with the cries of a prince, but with those of a princess named Elizabeth. King Henry's affection, once a blazing fire, begins to cool into the embers of impatience and disappointment. A new face appears at court, the quiet and demure Jane Seymour, a stark contrast to the fiery Queen Anne. In January 1536, a heavily armored King Henry falls during a joust, lying unconscious for 2 terrifying hours. The shock of the king's apparent death is too much for the pregnant Anne, who miscarries a male child. Henry, recovered but cold, stands over Anne and declares, "I see that God will not give me male children." This miscarriage was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a political catastrophe. In the ruthless world of the Tudor court, a queen's worth was measured in sons, and Anne had failed to deliver the only prize that mattered. The king, convinced he was cursed, now saw her not as his great love, but as the obstacle to his dynasty. His infatuation, which had reshaped a nation's religion, curdled into a dark and murderous resentment, and the whispers against the queen grew louder in the shadowy corners of the court. The architect of Anne's downfall was not the king alone, but his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. A man of immense intellect and terrifying ambition, Cromwell had once been Anne's ally in the great matter of the divorce. But now, she stood in the way of his own political agenda, particularly his desire to dissolve the monasteries and seize their wealth for the crown. For Cromwell, loyalty was a currency to be spent, and Anne's political capital was now bankrupt. He saw her removal as a grim but necessary piece of statecraft. Cromwell began to work in the shadows, forging an unholy alliance with the conservative factions at court who had always despised Anne. This included members of her own family, the powerful Howard clan, led by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. They saw her as an arrogant upstart who had forgotten her place. For them, her fall was not just political expediency, but a chance to restore their own family's traditional power, even if it meant sacrificing one of their own blood on the altar of ambition. The plot needed victims, men close to the Queen whose imagined crimes could be twisted into a believable narrative of treason. The first to be selected was Mark Smeaton, a handsome and talented court musician of low birth. He was ambitious, perhaps foolishly so, and known to admire the Queen from afar. This admiration, innocent as it may have been, made him the perfect first thread to pull, the weakest link in the chain that Cromwell intended to wrap around Anne's neck. Next in Cromwell's sights were men of the king's own privy chamber, gentlemen of high standing whose proximity to the Queen could be portrayed as sinister. Sir Henry Norris, a close friend of the king, was one such target. Sir Francis Weston, a charismatic young courtier, and William Brereton, a powerful groom of the chamber, were also selected. Their only crime was being part of Anne's vibrant, intellectual, and often flirtatious inner circle, a circle that Cromwell was now determined to paint as a nest of vipers. The most monstrous accusation required the most shocking target, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. He was brilliant, witty, and fiercely loyal to his sister. Their close bond, a source of strength and comfort, would be twisted by Cromwell's agents into the foulest of crimes, incest. This charge was designed not just to destroy Anne, but to obliterate the Boleyn name, to stain it so thoroughly that no one would dare to defend her or her memory. With his targets selected, Cromwell began to collect his evidence. This was not a process of investigation, but of fabrication. Spies were placed within the Queen's household, her every word, every gesture, every harmless flirtation noted down and passed to the king's minister. Casual conversations were ripped from their context and reassembled into a mosaic of treason. The Queen, oblivious, continued to live her life, unaware that the very air she breathed was poisoned with observation, and that her own servants were cataloguing her every move for the executioner. The king, his mind already poisoned against Anne, was fed a steady diet of these twisted reports. His ego, wounded by her failure to produce a son, and her spirited, often argumentative nature, was easily inflamed. Cromwell masterfully played on Henry's insecurities and his deep-seated fear of being made a cuckold. Every whispered rumor became solid proof, every innocent smile a sign of mockery. The king, who once defied the Pope for this woman, was now convinced she was a monstrous witch who had bewitched him and betrayed him with his own friends. Cromwell needed a confession, a starting point to make the entire conspiracy seem real. He knew that Mark Smeaton, the musician, was the most vulnerable. Unlike the aristocratic courtiers, Smeaton had no powerful family to protect him. He was a commoner who could be broken. His arrest was carefully planned, a swift and silent affair designed to instill maximum terror before the real work of interrogation began in the depths of the Tower of London. On the 30th of April, Mark Smeaton was taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney and subjected to a brutal, secret interrogation. While the official records are silent on the methods used, it is almost certain that he was tortured. The rack, the thumbscrews, or simply the unrelenting psychological terror of Cromwell's questions were brought to bear. Under this immense pressure, the young musician's spirit was shattered. He confessed to adultery with the Queen, a lie extracted through agony that would doom them all. The May Day joust of 1536 was the public stage for the beginning of the end. Queen Anne presided over the festivities, seemingly at ease, even dropping her handkerchief near Henry Norris. This innocent gesture would later be twisted into a secret signal. In the middle of the tournament, the king was handed a note. His face darkened, and without a word to the Queen, he abruptly rose and left with a small retinue, including Norris. A cold dread began to settle over the court as the king rode back to London, his purpose grim and unreadable. Sir Henry Norris was interrogated by the king himself during the ride back to Westminster. Henry, who had once considered Norris a dear friend, offered him a pardon if he would confess his guilt and implicate the Queen. Norris, a man of principle, staunchly refused. He would not save his own life by telling a lie that would condemn his Queen. His loyalty, a trait Henry once admired, was now seen as insolent defiance. Norris was sent to the Tower, his fate sealed by his own honor. The following morning, on the 2nd of May, the storm broke in full. A council meeting was called, and the Queen was summoned. As she entered the council chamber, the grim faces of the men, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, told her that something was terribly wrong. The charges were read out: adultery, incest, and conspiring the king's death. Anne reacted first with shocked laughter at the absurdity of the accusations, a laughter that quickly died in her throat as she realized they were deadly serious. Her protestations of innocence were ignored. The verdict had already been decided. She was arrested and informed that she would be taken to the Tower of London. The world she had fought so hard to conquer, the power she had wielded, all of it dissolved in an instant. She was no longer the Queen of England, but a prisoner of the state, her fate now in the hands of the very men who had orchestrated her ruin. The betrayal was absolute and overwhelming. The journey to the Tower was made by river, a public spectacle of humiliation. As her barge approached the fortress, she was not taken to the royal apartments she had stayed in before her coronation. Instead, the boat was steered towards the dark, ominous arch of the Traitor's Gate. This was the entrance for the most infamous prisoners, a one-way passage to despair and death. The symbolism was a deliberate and cruel psychological blow, designed to break her spirit before the interrogations even began. Upon landing, she fell to her knees on the stone steps, weeping and proclaiming her innocence to the sky and to the impassive guards. The constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, met her with a forced solemnity. He was her jailer, but he was also her spy. His instructions from Cromwell were clear. Record every word the Queen uttered, every frantic denial, every desperate question. Her prison cell was not to be a sanctuary, but a carefully monitored stage for her psychological disintegration. Inside her chambers, which were the same ones she had occupied in splendor before her coronation, Anne was attended by ladies-in-waiting she did not trust. These women were chosen by Cromwell for their loyalty to the king's cause, not to her. They were instructed to engage her in conversation, to draw out her memories and her fears, and to report everything back to Kingston. Every sigh, every tear, every rambling recollection of a past event was noted down, to be twisted and used against her. In her distress, Anne's mind raced, and she began to talk almost ceaselessly. She recalled a conversation with Henry Norris, where she had teased him about his love for her. She remembered a moment with Mark Smeaton, where she had chastised him for his overly familiar manner. To her, these were fragmented memories of innocent courtly life. To her jailers and to Cromwell, they were gold. Each utterance was a nail being hammered into her coffin, presented as evidence of her loose morals and treasonous flirtations. The net tightened as more arrests were made. Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton were taken into custody, their association with the Queen enough to condemn them. The final, most brutal arrest was that of her own brother, George. He was seized and brought to the Tower, accused of the unthinkable crime of incest. The news was delivered to Anne, a calculated blow designed to shatter her remaining composure. The idea that her beloved brother was now ensnared in this nightmare was a new level of horror. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man who owed his position to Anne, was one of the few who felt a flicker of sympathy. He wrote a cautious letter to the king, expressing his shock and hinting at his belief in the Queen's innocence. However, Cromwell intercepted the letter and forced Cranmer to add a postscript that completely undermined its original sentiment, praising the king's justice and accepting the Queen's guilt. Even the highest spiritual authority in the land was bent to Cromwell's will, leaving Anne utterly alone. The formal indictment was a work of fantastical fiction. It accused Anne of committing adultery with the 5 men and of having incestuous relations with her brother on multiple occasions. It further alleged that she and her lovers had conspired to kill the king and that she had promised to marry one of them after his death. The charges were a grotesque caricature, designed to paint her as a depraved monster who had bewitched the king and threatened the stability of the realm. It was a document not of law, but of propaganda. On the 12th of May, the first trial began. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and the tortured Smeaton were led into Westminster Hall to face a special commission of judges. The outcome was never in doubt. The trial was a mere formality, a piece of political theatre. The primary evidence against them was the confession extracted from Mark Smeaton under duress. When Smeaton was brought into the court, he was a broken man. He pleaded guilty, perhaps hoping for mercy that would never come. The other 3 men, all aristocrats, pleaded not guilty with courage and conviction. Henry Norris was particularly defiant. When confronted with the evidence, he denied it all, stating firmly that he believed the Queen was a good woman. He was offered his life once more if he would confess, and once more he refused. Their bravery was futile. In a system rigged for conviction, innocence was not a defense. It was an inconvenience to be swept aside. The jury, packed with men loyal to Cromwell and the king, delivered the only verdict they were ever going to. All 4 men were found guilty of high treason. The sentence was read out in all its gruesome detail. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This barbaric punishment was reserved for the worst traitors, a terrifying spectacle of disembowelment and dismemberment. The men received their sentence with stoic resignation, their fates now sealed as pawns in a much larger royal game. 3 days later, on the 15th of May, it was the turn of the Queen and her brother. Their trial was a grander affair, held in the King's Hall within the Tower of London. A special scaffold was built, and around 2,000 spectators were packed in to witness the show. The Lord High Steward presiding over the trial was none other than their own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. He sat in judgment, his face a cold, unfeeling mask, ready to condemn his own niece and nephew to death. Anne was brought in first, alone. Stripped of her royal retinue, she walked with a quiet dignity that impressed all who watched. She listened calmly as the litany of impossible charges was read out. When it was her turn to speak, she defended herself with intelligence and eloquence. She systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, answering every point with logic and clarity. The crowd was swayed. Many who had come expecting to see a monster now believed they were witnessing the persecution of an innocent woman. But her powerful defense was meaningless. The 26 noblemen who served as her jury had their orders. The Duke of Norfolk asked for their verdict. One by one, they stood and declared her guilty. Norfolk, with a chilling lack of emotion, pronounced the sentence. She was to be burned alive or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Upon hearing the sentence, Anne did not break. She raised her hands to heaven and declared her innocence before God, the only judge she now recognized. Then it was George's turn. He too defended himself with wit and passion. The primary piece of evidence against him for incest was a note, allegedly a record of a conversation where Anne had told her sister-in-law that the king had no skill in copulating with a woman. George was asked about this. In a moment of defiant folly, he read the note aloud to the court. The insult to the king's virility, now made public, enraged the judges and sealed his fate. It was an act of a man with nothing left to lose. Unsurprisingly, George was also found guilty. His uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, wept as he condemned his own nephew to the traitor's death of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The siblings were led away, having seen each other for the last time. The Boleyn faction, which had risen so high and so fast, had been utterly and brutally annihilated in a matter of hours, brought down by the machinations of Cromwell and the cold heart of a disappointed king. On the morning of the 17th of May, the 5 condemned men were led from the Tower to be executed on Tower Hill. A large crowd had gathered to witness the bloody spectacle. Mark Smeaton, still hoping for a pardon that would never come, publicly confessed his guilt on the scaffold. The others, however, maintained their innocence to the last. George Boleyn gave a long, eloquent speech, admitting he was a sinner, but never admitting to the crimes for which he was condemned. Henry Norris's final words were a powerful statement of his loyalty. He declared, "I desire you all to pray for me and to bear me witness that I die a good Christian man and I die a good subject." He refused to say more, protecting the Queen's honor even with his last breath. One by one, the men were beheaded. The king, in a small act of mercy, had commuted their sentences from the horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered to the relative swiftness of the axe. Their deaths were a grim overture to the Queen's own execution. While the men were being executed, Anne was being dealt a final, cruel humiliation. Archbishop Cranmer, the same man who had married her to the king, was sent to the Tower to inform her that her marriage was now declared null and void. The legal grounds were flimsy, based on Henry's previous affair with her sister Mary. This meant that Anne had never truly been the king's wife, and their daughter, Elizabeth, was now officially a bastard, stripped of her titles and her place in the line of succession. Anne's execution was scheduled for the 18th of May, but it was unexpectedly postponed. The delay was not an act of mercy, but one of meticulous, chilling preparation. Henry, who had once written her passionate love letters, now concerned himself with the theatrical details of her death. Dissatisfied with the clumsiness of the common executioner's axe, he decided to grant his former wife a final, backhanded honor. He sent a special messenger to Calais to fetch a master swordsman, renowned for his skill in beheading. The extra day in the Tower was a form of exquisite torture for Anne. She swung between moments of hysterical laughter and deep despair. She famously joked with the constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, about her impending death. Hearing that she would be killed with a sword, she laughed and said, "I hear say the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck," circling her throat with her hands. This gallows humor was the brave front of a terrified woman facing the abyss. On her last night, she requested to make her final confession. Archbishop Cranmer was once again summoned to her chambers. She received the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, and in its presence, she swore on the eternal salvation of her soul that she had never been unfaithful to the king. It was the most solemn oath a person of her time could make. Cranmer, it was said, left her cell with tears streaming down his face, privately convinced of her innocence, but publicly powerless to save her. The morning of the 19th of May, 1536, dawned grey and cold. Unlike the public spectacle on Tower Hill, Anne's execution was to be a more private affair, held within the secure walls of the tower on a newly built scaffold on the Tower Green. The audience was restricted to around 1,000 people, mostly officials, council members, and prominent citizens of London. It was a carefully managed event, designed to be a solemn and intimidating display of royal justice. Anne was led from her apartments, dressed in a dark grey damask gown trimmed with ermine and a red kirtle underneath. She walked with a steady pace, her ladies-in-waiting weeping behind her. She did not appear as a broken woman, but as a queen, composed and dignified to the very end. Her eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, a collection of men who had once bowed to her and now stood to watch her die. Among them was Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her ruin, his face a neutral mask. She mounted the few steps to the scaffold and turned to address the crowd. Her final speech was a masterpiece of careful wording. In a clear voice, she asked the people to pray for the king, calling him a good, gentle, and sovereign lord. She did not confess to the crimes she was charged with, but she also did not proclaim her innocence, as that would have been an act of treason in itself. Instead, she said, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." She finished her speech, entrusting her soul to Jesus Christ. She knelt down, and her ladies removed her ermine mantle and headdress, revealing her long dark hair, which was then tucked into a coif. She gave her final farewells to her weeping attendants. The executioner, a man known for his swiftness, approached and asked for her forgiveness, which she gave. She was ready. The air grew thick with a terrible, silent anticipation. Anne knelt at the block, her posture erect, and began to pray, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The swordsman, wanting a clean strike, needed to distract her so that she would not flinch. He called out, "Where is my sword?" And as Anne's head instinctively turned to look, he drew the weapon which had been hidden in the straw. In a single, fluid motion, he swung the heavy, two-handed blade. The sword sliced through her neck with silent, lethal precision. Her head fell to the straw-covered boards, her lips still said to be moving in prayer. Her body, for a moment, remained upright before slumping to the ground. One of her ladies-in-waiting stepped forward, covered the severed head with a white cloth, and cradled it. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, let out a collective gasp of horror and perhaps of pity. A cannon was fired from the tower walls, the prearranged signal to the king, who was waiting for the news miles away in Epping Forest. Upon hearing the shot, Henry, who was about to begin a hunt, reportedly exclaimed, "It is done. The business is done. Uncouple the greyhounds and let us follow the sport." His mourning was non-existent. The woman for whom he had broken with the church and transformed his kingdom was dead, and his only thought was for his own pleasure and his imminent marriage to Jane Seymour. Back at the Tower, there was no coffin ready for the former queen. Her body and head were unceremoniously placed into an old arrow chest found in the armory. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower's walls. She was laid to rest alongside the men who had been accused with her, including her own brother. The great Queen Anne Boleyn, who had held the fate of England in her hands, was now nothing more than a discarded body in a borrowed box, her name and memory erased by the man who once claimed to love her above all others.